The musicians play their instruments. I play the orchestra.
Adaptations of biographies, commonly referred to as biopics, have been popular since the first days of film. Literally. The story of the Kelly Gang, generally believed to be one of the first features ever made, is a biopic. Ever since the Kelly Gang was released in 1906, the biopic has maintained a firm stance within the medium. It's not the most popular of genres, but only because it's not really a genre in itself. A biopic can be a drama or it can be a comedy. In fact, the biopic has appeared in so many forms throughout its history that only one element remains to unite it. It's based on a true story, but it's not always that simple. In adapting the life of an individual that has been dead for tens, hundreds, or even thousands of years, finding the real truth behind them can often become nearly impossible. And even if that truth were available, it can easily become corrupted or convoluted. It's almost inevitable. How do you expect a life spanning oftentimes over 80 years to fit inside a film limited to just 2 hours? The death of Apple icon Steve Jobs in 2011 was followed by the release of 2 drastically different films, which make for an interesting case study. The first is Jobs, and the second is Steve Jobs. In comparing these 2 films today, despite them relying on the exact same source material, a clear consensus emerges. Steve Jobs is the better movie, and that fact, for me, begs the question of, is there a right way to go about making these films? Is there a right way to adapting an individual? Let's start with Jobs to see if we can understand why that film doesn't work. On paper, it should. In fact, it should work way better than Steve Jobs. It's certainly a much more faithful account of the life of Steve. It takes us through all the significant twists and turns of his career, from life as an aimless hippie to a tech revolutionary, then an outcast, and then a revolutionary again. For a person who hasn't read Jobs' biography and isn't intimately familiar with his roots, this might actually be the better film. It's all there. Ashton Kutcher even looks more like Jobs than Michael Fassbender. The problem, however, is that it's all there from the wrong point of view. I think that the most important thing to consider when adapting the life of any individual is the relationship between who they are and what they've achieved. Apple is a monumental company that is still thriving 10 years after Steve passed, so it's easy to mistake the story being about that. But Apple wouldn't exist without Steve. It's an extension of him, not the other way around. The biggest mistake that Jobs, the film, makes is portraying Steve through the lens of his company. His life began when he started Apple in his garage. He found his true calling as its CEO and reached his near godlike status after the releases of the iMac and the iPod at the turn of the century. Jobs insists on historical accuracy as the most important element of the biopic. It speeds through every significant event in Jobs' career, hoping to capture his essence, but the relationships at the center of these events barely get a mention. The entire issue of Jobs' daughter, which serves as the emotional heart of the second film, is reduced to a brief cameo. All of the significant wins in the film are Apple's, and the characters at the center of them are just plot devices along for the ride. Jobs' misguided strive towards historical accuracy comes at the cost of not just character, but also conflict. When the characters lack strong identities, the storytelling quickly starts to feel bland and forced. Instead of a biopic, it quickly turns into a series of scenes made in service of the audience, not the story. Just take a look at this scene where the 2 Steves come up with the name Apple.
It needs to be something that you see and you're just like, man, I just gotta have it. Apple.
Excuse me? Apple like the fruit?
It's meant as a significant moment in the film, the point at which Apple was finally born. Only for Steve the character, Apple didn't exist yet. There was no trillion-dollar company, there was no revolution. Just like the rest of the film, it's a scene written purely for the audience who have in their minds mythicized the larger-than-life company that they know and love. Under the pretense of historical accuracy, the film turns itself into fan fiction. So, one way to fail at the biopic is to let the achievements overshadow the achiever. But how can this be avoided? Let's take a look at Steve Jobs. Unlike Jobs, Steve Jobs is very clearly an account on the man himself, not the company he founded. Instead of 30 years, it focuses on 3 important days in the life of Steve. The release of the Macintosh in 1984, the next in 1986, and the iMac in 1998. In deciding to focus on such small windows, Steve Jobs manages to achieve a few things. First of all, it frees itself from the responsibility of having to tell the entire story and allows itself to focus on the characters. And second, it introduces conflict. Momentum is oftentimes the easiest thing to lose sight of when depicting narratives that take place over years or even decades. And how does Steve Jobs do it? Through conflict. Never-ending, decade-spanning conflict. The famous quote by Robert McKee goes like this: "True character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation. The truer the choice to the character's essential nature." In other words, to truly understand who an individual is, we must put them under pressure and see how they react. And Steve Jobs puts his character under enormous pressure from every imaginable angle. Chrisanne is pressuring him to accept his fatherhood, John Scully to sacrifice vision on behalf of building a solid business, and Andy Hertzfeld demanding that the things Steve insists on doing simply cannot be done. Every single person in the film, including his secretary Joanna and best friend Wozniak, is at odds with Steve, and it is through this conflict that we get to see Steve grow as a human as well as a business leader. At this point, I think it's worth pointing out just how different this approach actually is from the first film. Steve Jobs sacrifices any sort of narrative consistency or historical accuracy almost entirely, whereas Jobs is obsessed with depicting events as they happened, to the extent where they were even filmed in some of the real locations. Steve Jobs just doesn't care. Most of these people probably weren't there for the events in question, and if by chance they were, then none of the highly shocking conversations depicted actually happened. But it doesn't matter, because in sacrificing historical accuracy and neglecting the chronological order of events, Steve Jobs opens itself to a much more intimate study about the man himself. Who was he at these points in his life? Early on, he's a childish radical. He refuses to acknowledge his daughter and values unfounded perfectionism over running an actual company. After his firing, he becomes much more controlled, more open and much warmer, but also calculative and bitter. And at last, he becomes the man that we all think we know, the uncompromising visionary sitting on top of the most successful company in history. But it's still not about Apple. There are a few brilliant things that Steve Jobs does in enforcing the company as an extension of Steve, and not the other way around. First off, the film never shows any of the actual events despite building them up for almost 2 hours. Instead, the payoff of the film comes from a simple interaction between Jobs and his daughter. Second, the film depicts Apple as an extension of Steve's personality. We start off with an emotionally closed-off man symbolically struggling to open a closed computer.
Why can't he get into the machine?
You need special tools.
What kind of special tools?
And end up with a man who learns how to compromise and even put his own emotional interest over that of his company, making both of them better in the progress. The company is a lens through which Steve communicates with the world. There's a brilliant scene towards the end of the film where Jobs, not wanting his daughter to walk away, promises to put 1,000 songs into her pocket. This is what gets her interest. He doesn't have the words for her, but the products that he makes do. It's a wonderful scene as it highlights not just the personality of Steve, but also the emotional reach of the company that he founded. Danny Boyle, the film's director, speaking of the creative liberties that he took with portraying Steve Jobs, said that it was what Shakespeare used to do. He would take some of the facts about a man of power, and he would guess a lot of the rest, and had just gotten away at actually getting the human in it. It's a line of reasoning that every biopic ever made is guilty of to a degree. It's all tainted, so if there's no way for us to get it right, then what's the point? Well, to me, biopics are kind of like testimonials. They'll never fully capture the essence of an individual, but they may introduce you to one. They may make you care about Jobs, or William Wallace, or Queen Anne, enough to look them up and study them. But in order to be successful at that, they have to make you care, be it historically accurate or not. They have to give you something to hang on to. And the only way how you can really fail at this is by separating the individual from their achievements, by portraying them through the lens of something that they've done, not who they are. Jobs to me was just a film, but Steve Jobs sent me on an afternoon-long adventure into the depths of Google to find out more about this man and who he really was. And that, to me, is how you adapt an individual.